That's the soldier. Thank you. The Soldiers and Sailors Monument. He's the architect. So also, I see some new faces here. So if you're not a member of Indiana German Heritage Society, I'm just going to give that pathetic thing to go on channel 20. Please join. So please join us. I remember. You are. Okay. Here's your opportunity. And would you, Albrecht, would you pass this on to that young lady right behind you there? And the rest of you are covered. And in case you haven't paid your dues, there it is. Checks in the mail. Right. And also, for your reading pleasure, we have some copies of German Life. This is the current issue. And take it with you when you go. Now, on with the show. Lee Little. Lee Little is a friend of mine. We met at the Indiana Historical Society, and he was looking up stuff about Germans of Indiana. I go, well, that's interesting. That's my favorite topic. So we started talking and talking and talking. And next thing you know, he joined up, and then he got himself elected secretary and on the board of directors. So Lee has a long history, long-ish history with the Indiana German Heritage Society. And he's a very interesting young fellow, graduate of Xavier University. He had a double major. That always amazes me, a double major in my two favorite topics, German and history. Then he's a graduate of IU Law School and with a JD degree. That doesn't stop him. He is the law librarian at the IU McKinney School of Law, and also has a library science degree. This guy's unstoppable. He's currently the historiographer of the Episcopal Church. Is that the Episcopal Church?
The entire thing.
Of the United States of America?
The Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America.
Wow. Listen to that guy. As I said, he's unstoppable. So I want to welcome my friend back and let him share with you and me his findings on Indianapolis's historic German churches. Lee Little.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone. I want to first start by thanking my friend Katie for helping make all of this possible. She is the wonderful photographer that did all of the things that you actually want to look at in the book that just came out this year called Circle City Steeples, of which many of the churches that are featured tonight are present. So Katie's in the back. She is fantastic. She's from Fort Wayne and went to St. Paul's, Missouri Synod Lutheran, if you're familiar with that. Gorgeous church, and now has brought her skills down to the metropolitan Indianapolis area. So tonight, we are going to be talking about Indianapolis German churches. So you may be wondering, how does a French Huguenot, French Cajun, and Scottish and Irish young man get so interested in churches and in Indianapolis German heritage generally, and how do those two overlap? Well, as Bill said, I have a German degree from the university. I started taking German because I liked the way it sounded, which is kind of odd to some folks that don't speak the language, but then also it was the only program in high school that allowed for an exchange trip. So I somehow weaseled my way into that and fallen in love with the language and the culture and the people, and with this lovely organization that has done so much good work throughout the state. So thank you all for being here tonight. And the reason that I'm so interested in all of these historic churches and in the city of Indianapolis is because this is home. And I am a man of faith. I'm currently Episcopalian, although depending on how the Spirit moves, maybe I'm Pentecostal, much to Bill's chagrin. But you know, those things happen, right? The life is long and the spiritual journey is long. So I love the way that churches can tell the story of a city. Churches can tell the story of a settlement. Churches can tell the story of people living in a city, in a neighborhood, in a broader area. So all of that is to say that I also love beautiful buildings, of which we are currently in one. And I think that those two things coming together is how this project all started. So I started this project called Old Churches Indy in 2018. My first two pictures on Instagram were of First Presbyterian and the former First Congregationalist at the corner of Delaware and 16th Street. It was a snowy, cold January morning, and my wife wanted me to go take the dog for a walk. So I said, I'm going to take some pictures of churches, and I ended up taking pictures of those two. That one beautiful one and the other one across the street that still stands as a testament to how the neighborhood built and how people have moved in and out of the neighborhood over time. So that was the start of a gigantic project that's still ongoing today. I have visited and researched more than 600 individual congregations across the history of Indianapolis, been to 300 or so, and done deep dives of the book on 35. Katie has put many more miles on her car, driving back and forth to Whiteland and Second Pres on the far north side to take all the pictures, but something about being in the Circle City and being in your car, feeling like you're in the Speedway. So of those, I think that there's a good percentage of them, of those 300 that still stand, and of the 600 that were standing in 1955, that have German roots of some kind, regardless of who is in the congregation now or what wound up destroying the building, be it the interstate or a fire or other types of development. I think that it's an interesting lens to see exactly where the Germans were, where they have left their mark, and how those buildings have changed over time. So maybe. The first thing that we need to talk about, though, is the religiosity of Germany generally. Maybe. This is a map of the German Reich around 1890, showing in blue where the Catholics are, showing in that sort of peach color where the sort of mixed color, this sort of magenta, where the mixtures are. So sort of in the middle, you can see generally down in Bavaria and up into the Rhineland, that's where a lot of the Germans are, the German Catholics are. So very, very heavily German Catholic. And then as you get further and further north, you'll see much more Protestant influence. This also includes stretches over into what is now Poland, but that would have been East Prussia at the time. And there was, still precedent today for Poland being a largely Catholic country. They have subsumed a lot of that. Well, the Germans were expelled about 1945, but the Poles have remained largely Catholic, including our now esteemed and late Pope, John Paul II. So when you're looking at these churches, when you're looking at them in Indianapolis and in the United States generally, you're going to see different denominations based on who was settling in which particular area. So if you're looking at a German Catholic church, you can generally assume that they're from one of those blue areas. If you're looking at a German Protestant church, you're generally going to be from one of those peach colored areas. But generally. Again, a lot of this is generalizations, and specific instances will differ. There may be German Catholics in Berlin, there may be German Protestants in deepest Bavaria. It all just sort of is kind of an accident of history and how politics in Europe have worked over time. So that's one thing. The other thing is the importance of what's called Vereinsleben in German, and the way that German folks, historically, even to the present day, have come together in clubs, in groups of mutual interest. So I went to school at Xavier University in Cincinnati. Cincinnati is an incredible city for German heritage. Over the Rhine is prime spot now for a lot of that. But for instance, there was a Senfverein, which was a club for people that like mustard. Right? So it's not only the religious interests, it's also secular interests. And so then there's that mixing of the two as well. So for instance, the Athenaeum was a Verein for people interested in Turnen, which is sort of gymnastics, those types of things. I've heard this called by somebody sitting in this room, the secular temple of German culture in Indianapolis, situated between two religious temples of German culture, with St. Mary's just a block that way and Zion Evangelical United Church of Christ just a block that way. And then the Masonic temple right across the street, but that's a different story entirely. So Within the congregations themselves, you're going to be seeing churches and different interest groups of, like, there's going to be a women's group, there's going to be a men's group, there's going to be a choral group, there's going to be a liturgical group, all these different groups within these different places, within these different congregations that all stem back to where they are in Germany, where their family came from, and all of these different types of topics that sort of are intersecting, because you can't have one without the other. Nothing is just its own thing, it's all connected. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with clusters of churches, because the Germans, regardless of their denomination, are going to come together and sort of settle in the same neighborhoods. So what is interesting about this sort of discussion is the neighborhoods that Germans settled in. You can see here that that is now called the Cyrus Place, the one in the foreground. It is the old Salem Evangelical Association, the Lockwood Square United Methodist Church. It folded around 2010, 2012 when it merged with the Central Avenue Methodist congregation, and then they folded shortly thereafter. But you can see here that you have one in the foreground, is a German church. You have one in the midground, that's a German church. You have one in the background, that's a German church. So what does that all mean? It means that these people that were interacting in commerce, they were interacting in religious circles, they were building in the same general areas as each other, regardless of their denomination. So we'll get into that. I have a map that is very exciting. So I want to break this down a little bit. I mentioned that there were Catholic Germans, there are then Protestant Germans. Who is the sort of head that you might think of, the sort of predominant figure in German Protestantism? I'll take a hand. Luther. Martin Luther, exactly. So Martin Luther, named a heretic by the Roman Catholic Church, gave his name to Lutheranism. That is one of the main denominations of Protestantism in Indiana. Fort Wayne being a major center with Concordia Seminary, the beautiful St. Paul's that was mentioned earlier, and I think like 7 or 8 other Lutheran congregations in a very, very close grouping downtown. All of them are still relatively packed to this day. Indianapolis had 5 congregations of Lutherans around town that were strictly German. There are others, there's English Germans, there are I guess there are German English folks that are currently on the throne, but that's a conversation for a different time. There are German Lutherans, of which there were 5 congregations. There were 3, I'm counting 3, German Catholic churches, and I'll get to these in just a moment. Then as you go down and you remove yourself from the Lutheranism of German Protestantism, you get into the sort of more continental, non-German types of Protestantism, like the evangelical or the German evangelical Reformed denomination that are more, I think, being raised a young Catholic now in High Church Anglo-Catholic, Episcopalian. Reformed is more Swiss, stemming from John Calvin. My theology is not there. I have not studied it to any extent, but the United Church of Christ, which you will see is largely made up of East Coast Anglo congregations and Midwest German congregations. There was a series of mergers over time where the German evangelical, German Reformed turned into the evangelical and Reformed denomination, and then those merged with the Anglos in 1954, which you can see here. There were 7 congregations leading up to that, generally of German stock, and then the United Methodist grouping. There were several German Methodist congregations. There's also what's called the United Brethren, which gives its name to the United Methodist denomination. Then there's also what's called the Evangelical Association, sort of a predecessor to German Methodism in the United States. Yeah, Albright. Yep, you're taking the words right out of my mouth. Thank you. Then finally, there was one German Baptist congregation in Indianapolis. And that fizzled very, very quickly. I think it met in a decommissioned beer garden over on the southwest side. And, you know, they had their way with that and it died out pretty quickly. I want to emphasize here as well that I'm only talking about the city limits of Indianapolis before 1970, before Unica consolidated Marion County with Indianapolis city government. So there are several churches out in the townships of Marion County that are not included here. Those are interesting, but those are not the focus of my study. I'm more interested in how all of these different churches collided with each other, how they interacted. A farm church is a beautiful thing, but it's still a farm church. An example of that would be the church that gives German Church Road its name over on the far east side. St. John's, I think that was evangelical when it was started, but it was at least a UCC by the time it was decommissioned as a church. So this is sort of the scope of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So the German Catholic churches, I am starting with St. John's because that is the mother church of Catholicism in Indianapolis. It was known as Holy Cross prior to 1850 when it was still out where the front lawn of the Idlejohn is, before it moved to its present location over by the Convention Center on Georgia and Capitol. So that housed all of the Catholics for several years until 1858 when St. Mary's was established. So St. Mary's, the beautiful church that we see 2 blocks a block that way, founded in 1858 as the German Catholic Church in Indianapolis. From there then in 1875, Sacred Heart, I believe, was an offshoot of that. That was for the German Catholics that were sort of being shepherded by the Franciscans on the south side. And then St. Anthony over in Hawville, founded in 1891, now a predominantly Hispanic congregation, as neighborhoods have shifted over time. One interesting thing about St. Anthony and that neighborhood is that in 1911, maybe a little bit earlier, Holy Trinity was created for the slow foods that moved into the neighborhood that were imported by the metalworks in that neighborhood. They wanted their own national parish. So the Archdiocese was like, you can pay for it, you can have it. So that's what they did. And in 2014, just over a century after it was founded, it was subsumed back into St. Anthony's as numbers started to dwindle over time and demographics shifted outwards towards the suburbs. So here is a picture of the beautiful St. John's with its new steeples. They have just been cleaned earlier this year. You can see that for many, many years, they were patinaed to a copper green. It's a verdigris, I believe is the proper French pronunciation. But the steeples have just been cleaned. This was a Dietrich A. Bohlen project built starting in 1868 and completed in 1872. The spires were not added until the early 1890s by Dietrich's son, I believe. So there's an interesting old woodcut of the building like that with no steeples. And then the steeples were added and it's sort of showing the before and after. So as I'm going through these pictures, I want you to be making notes about the different architectural styles that you're seeing. What is separating the different denominations in terms of how their buildings are constructed? I think that that's a really fascinating way of looking at these buildings, not only in terms of how people are interacting with the buildings themselves, but what are the buildings saying? This would have been a gigantic structure, and it still is to this day, but especially back in the 1870s, this would have been seen from miles away. The steeples, pointing you straight up to heaven, all those types of things. It's designed to make a big impact and impress you. It's a very Baroque approach to architecture in terms of its impressiveness, but the interior is very much Gothic revival. And keep that Gothic revival in your mind as we're looking at these other buildings. So remember I said St. John's, mother church of Catholicism in Indianapolis. This beautiful, beautiful structure that has been under construction, so it's not featured in the book, unfortunately, was built starting in 1910.
Yeah, I just want to tell you real quick that Jim's, maybe you know that, did you know that he's the architect in charge of the restoration that's going on?
Current. Thank you for your service. Can you put the interior back in place? Did I say that up?
That's going to be a very costly proposition. The interior was incredible. Your were talking about, seeing the photos, it's nothing like these towns.
Yeah.
Vatican II.
And they spend so much destroying it.
They destroyed it. It's incredible.
It is.
But I think a lot of the paint is still underneath.
Oh, that's great.
Yes, and I think we're going to be able to get some stratigraphic studies done.
Fantastic.
There, which is fabulous.
So super exciting. I think preservation is a thing to keep in mind as well as we're working through like what's happening as congregations are folding and leaving these buildings. Not that St. Mary's is being abandoned anytime soon. For the love of God, please no. But what happens with preservation? How do we treat these buildings? Do we turn them into something like St. Joseph's, which is an old Catholic church that's now a brewery? Or do we turn it into something like Grove House, which is now sort of an Airbnb old Baptist church? It depends. I would rather see the buildings upkept and cared for in a new function if the religious function is being removed. But it needs to be a respectful conversation with people in the congregations as we move forward. So this particular building, there was an older one that was then deconsecrated around 1910 and stood until the 30s, I think, on Maryland Street,
Yes.
Closer towards the south side, you might say at the time.
It's located with Simon Ice Skating.
Oh.
Is being built.
Okay. Yeah, so it's right by Gainbridge Fieldhouse. Conseco is what stuck in my mind as the name for it. But this was designed by an architect in Chicago named Herman Dahl, who was visiting Indianapolis to design the Home City Brewing Company Bottling Works, which is now Indiana City Brewery. And he fell in love with an indie girl and said, "Thank you so much for your service. I will design this church for you." He designed it after the Cologne Cathedral. So again, it's kind of like St. John's, 2 spires. This is much more ornate and elaborate in its design on the exterior, at least. The interior, since Vatican II, which I believe the closing ceremony is their 60th anniversary was yesterday or something like that. Gutted not only St. Mary's, but also several other Catholic churches around town, including the cathedral, which I don't want to upset Bill more than I already have.
St. Mine's,
Whole bunch of them around the state. So here's another look. You probably saw this, have seen it before. Twin spires, and then there's what's called a flèche, F-L-E-C-H-E, a flèche. I don't speak French. Flèche. Like Nick Lachey of 98 Degrees. But here's that's to denote where the altar is. That's my understanding of it, at least. It's like we have these 2 big things at the front to show you how to get to the church. Then as you're looking, you can see where the altar is. That is not presently where the altar is, I think, but it's relatively close.
How does the height of those spires compare to St. John? Do they try to make it taller, or equal, or less?
I'm not sure. I think those are about the same height. I think.
You know,
I'm sorry.
the height. How do these spires in height compare to St. John?
I don't know about that comparison. They're 164 feet top and about 1/2, a little less than 1/2 the size of the AUL bank or insurance one.
Okay.
But it is 1/3.
It's incredible.
One cathedral, which is 555.
Wow.
Which is as high as the Regent's Bank. One cathedral spires that's the height of each one.
Wow. So that's just incredible. And I think it goes to show like the importance of community and like we are here, we are a presence in this city. We are building these gigantic buildings that show the presence of our faith and of our tradition in this neighborhood. So next we have Sacred Heart on the south side. 1875 is still the head of Franciscan community in Indianapolis. Franciscans are the ones that wear the brown robes and they meet there. There was a 2004 fire that gutted the interior, and they were able to, by insurance money, by diocesan money, archdiocesan money, do I think, a complete loving renovation of the interior that is just, the inside of it is the most beautiful space in the city. I will fight you on that if you say otherwise. I just think that like there is really something to be said for the ornateness, the smacking you in the face with all the imagery and the gilding and the color and the scent, incense scent, smell, and all of that, that really, it is tough to mimic in another type of building or any other building in the city, really. So this was built by a Franciscan from Indianapolis, Missouri, named Brother Anton Favor. And he was very prolific around the country in this time. This was built in 1890, and it, is sort of a showcase of pre-Vatican II Catholic devotion and liturgy. In 2014, I believe, we had a German mass there said by Father Clem Davis. And it was, I believe, the first time since the 60s that there would have been a German mass said in the city, which is pretty interesting.
Great occasion.
Yes, it was. So shifting gears a little bit to the next step down the Reformation rabbit hole, to the German Lutheran congregations. So I believe that St. Paul's Missouri Lutheran, which still exists in some truncated form on the south side today, is the mother church of German Lutheranism in Indianapolis. What is now Sanctuary on Penn at Penn and Walnut was the English Lutheran church in town. That got its start in 1837 and folded in 2008, 2010, somewhere around there. But these are the German Lutherans. So you have St. Paul's, got Trinity Missouri Synod Lutheran, and Emmaus. So here is Trinity. That's the one that we saw in the middle ground of that old picture. You can see, still very impressive. I'm trying to stay in the camera. Still very impressive. Gothic revival. Gothic revival, very common in German church architecture. It's the brick Gothic that's particularly interesting. A lot of these congregations were relatively not as moneyed. So they would use brick rather than limestone. So it's interesting, Christ Church on Monument Circle was one of the very few churches at the time to be built through and through with stone rather than sort of casing it and building something out of frame and then casing it with limestone. So all of the accounts of that at the time were wonderful accounts of how it was built so sturdily with all of that limestone, which no expense was spared, certainly. But the big thing about Gothic revival architecture are the pointed windows. That's really the big marker. There are certainly a lot of minutiae and variations across sub-variants of the style. But if you'll see, you can see the pointed windows, a lot of massing, but also it feels very light when you're inside. So as you look up, your eye is sort of drawn up to the ceiling, the heavens, as it were. And then the spire as well is there. So this congregation, Trinity, still exists on the far east side. There are, I believe, 2 Trinity Lutheran congregations in Indianapolis. One is the former Danish Lutheran Church. The other is this one. Yeah. I think that the former Danish one, which was in Holy Cross Danish Church neighborhood, that building still exists. Yeah, Holy Rosary. Holy Cross is that way. But they still exist, but I believe they're Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the ELCA. I could not find, as I was going through this, any pictures of the other congregations. So Emmaus is also Gothic, or it's actually sort of a mixture of Romanesque revival and Richardsonian Romanesque. There's a lot of heavy massing in it. So it's a very sturdy looking structure while retaining some of the Gothic revival pointed windows and things. And then St. Paul's now is a very small, very modern building on the far south side. So I did not deem that to be worthy of inclusion.
St. Paul's sat down there, I mean,
It was on the
When-
Lilly
when
campus,
was it?
2000.
I was gonna say, my kids were still playing ball at CYO Center. And I
This
just,
property is now part of the Lilly campus.
yeah, it is, I remember.
New Jersey and it's across the street.
Morris? McCartney? Like that.
Escapes me.
And May is, I was gonna tell you, I taught at Lutheran.
Oh, okay.
School for 9 years, over a decade. And anyway, a former student of mine is the pastor there, and he often posts pictures on his Facebook page of the interior, which looks very much like the inside of the church
Yeah,
of that era.
it's
It's
beautiful.
so Lutheran, it almost looks Catholic.
I know, they got a little,
Just like
Sanctuary.
Just like St. Paul in Fort Wayne.
So I would say it's more impressive than many of the Catholic churches in town. So shifting gears a little bit further down the Reformation scale, we have the evangelical and Reformed congregations. So there's Zion Evangelical, which is now Zion Evangelical United Church of Christ, block north of here. That was established in 1844. The evangelical church in North America was, before it merged, an offshoot or the North American version of the Prussian state Protestant church. So the established church of the Protestant state of Prussia came to the United States, and was the evangelical wing of what is now the United Church of Christ. So that was the first one, 1844. I wanted to ask a brief trivia question. What occurred in Indianapolis? What was built in 1837 that sort of opened it up to the rest of the world? What arrived? Railroad was a little bit later.
The canal that went nowhere.
I ascribe it to the construction of the Michigan Road and the National Road, so that folks could get from east to west, from north to south, relative ease. So you'll see a lot of these foundations in the exact year that it was finished. It brought a lot of Irish workers, a lot of German workers to the state. And then shortly thereafter, within 7 years of that being established, a lot of Germans came, a lot of Germans stayed. This was sort of the pre-1848 revolutions that were displacing a lot of folks in Greater Germany at the time. So an offshoot of that congregation is St. John's Evangelical, which we have a member of here tonight. That was established in 1896 and then first reformed. There have been many different congregations over time. So it wound up dying, so to speak, as Ellenberger United Church of Christ at 10th and Ritter. That was the last iteration of this congregation that had existed since 1852. There were also many other smaller, more flash in the pan congregations under the Reformed and Evangelical denominations, but it would take far too long. We'll be here for a long time tonight.
The Zion actually was first Lutheran, because in 1844, when they put that church together, a whole group of people got together, and it had the longest name of any church. Protestantische, evangelische, lutherische, reformierte Zionskirche von Indianapolis. So the Lutherans were actually in there. And if you look at the constitution of the church, which they still have,
Oh, cool.
it's in the big bold safe in the office. They crossed out the Lutheran because they broke off the next year
Oh, okay.
and went down for the St. Paul.
St. Paul.
Yeah.
And then took the Lutheran out and was the Protestantische.
Fascinating.
So actually, Zion was the first Lutheran church as it were.
One thing that's very interesting and easy to do with all of this type of research is to gloss over things. So these small minutiae that are so important do take up a lot of brain space. So here's a picture of Zion. Their second building, I believe, is also a D.A. Bolin build from 1912. They were down on Ohio Street, a couple of blocks west of Burbank. So Gothic revival, you can still see it's got sort of these finials on top of the tower. There's a fourth one. They, a couple of years ago, shifted their belfry from a actual bell ringing situation to an electronic one. It's just a loudspeaker, and it changes the vibe a little bit. But it kind of looks like a castle. It goes back to that sort of German Protestant approach to God of Ein fester Burg ist unser Gott, a mighty fortress is our God. I like it. Again, it's sort of this brick revival, Gothic revival style. There's the interior. Alois Long was a Bavarian wood carver, and he did that altarpiece. I believe there's another one down at the Lutheran Church in Fountain Square, which is now sort of an independent congregation, as synods in Lutheranism do. But again, luscious wood, very dark, deep, rich colors. Still liturgical in its approach, but a little bit less than what you might see in a German Catholic or a German Lutheran church. Here is the
last one that had German language services. Is Zion Church.
They still have them during Advent and Lent.
On Good Friday at 10 o'clock. And then the third Sunday in Advent is the Advent
Gaudete stuff.
Yeah,
the pink one in the afternoon with a nice imbiss to follow.
So you can still hear German religious services in the city on a yearly basis.
One of the ushers.
Huh. So here's the former First Reformed Church. This is right across from Sun King. I've wondered for years what this is. And this was, I think, their second building from the 1870s. And it's so nondescript, right? It's just like a little brick Gothic revival structure that's now, I think, a business or something, some sort of like security company. They wound up moving up to Brookside neighborhood and then out by Irvington. So
Just though they butchered that up in '83. They took out the original doors, the original windows. Well, at least the building's still there.
Reformed. So at least it still stands, right? Kind of. So here we have this is Emmanuel, United Church of Christ, what I believe was Emmanuel Reformed. This was, I believe, second or third Reformed church. There's an interesting story here with the architect. He skipped town shortly after building this building and was found dead with a suicide note, how he was going to assassinate the president. Interesting stuff. So don't want to do in that round. This is Prospect and by the old Suicide to Tornferai.
So it's just west of East Street.
Yeah.
About just west of East. West of East Street.
Yeah.
Now it's a school or
This piece here was the church and the parish offices and the school.
Sunday school.
Yeah. So an interesting thing architecturally about this is that it's not the Gothic revival style. It's in what's called the Rundbogenstil. So rather than having the peaked windows, it's rounded arches. It's much more Romanesque in its approach. So if you're looking at other churches around town that might have a similar style, look at Roberts Park United Methodist or what is now the Cyrus Place, that former Lockwood Square United Methodist.
Who was the architect of that?
I can't remember.
Is he German?
He was. Here's another picture of it, sort of viewed straight on. I like it. It's charming.
Yeah, very quirky.
Yeah. The interior apparently has been completely whitewashed. I wanted to get in there for the book, but then was like, the outside is not pretty enough to warrant the horrors that were inflicted upon the sanctuary.
This is Reform.
Yes, it's still an active congregation. They've got a dog park to get with all the yuppies in the neighborhood.
This is UCC.
Yeah. So this is a very storied building that has a very interesting way of looking at the city and the city's history. So this is the former St. Paul's Reformed in Hawthorne. This is at 709 Belmont. And you can see here, Gothic Revival style, very simplified. You know, you have the massing, but you still have the pointed windows. It's got the year of construction, 1887, over the little porch. This was a German Reformed congregation in Hawville. Hawville was relatively well populated by both Germans, Slovenes, and there was a sizable black population starting from the 1880s, really. And all of them sort of bumped up against each other. Wes Montgomery, the jazz guitarist, was born over there. So this building holds special place in city history because after the Germans left, it became, and still is, the it's not Mount Zion, but it is the parish that Moselle Sanders of Indianapolis civil rights fame had for many, many years. And the congregation that he started in this building is still active doing work in Hawville this day. So that's what I think is so interesting. We started in these buildings with one particular denomination doing its own thing, sort of telling the story as it's going along. And then at the end of that particular congregation's life, another church moves in and they're still worshiping God on a regular basis, doing work in the community and serving other folks as they see fit, which I think like really speaks to sort of Christian unity and things like that. So First United Brethren, there were many other United Brethren congregations around town, including one that is right by what's now University of Indianapolis. That was a United Brethren college until it was, I believe, secularized at some point. But here it is. So you may recognize this. You may also see that there are two little gnats sort of streaming around, and there he is. That is a steeplejack fixing the steeple. This was taken in the mid-40s when the congregation was still quite large and quite active. The building was turned into what's called the Cyrus Place. I think he's Greek or Turkish. Persian. I apologize. You
can see how the steeplejack, I have a friend that's a steeplejack back in Jasper. They go up to the top that they can, they put a ladder across the two openings, and then they hang from that ladder.
You could not pay me enough. Although I could probably just reach up. But there was a loving restoration done to this building from probably 2014 to 2017 or so. And now it's an event space. There's a cafe over there. Remember how I called that earlier one with the rounded windows Rundbogenstil? Similar type of thing. It's got the rounded windows. It's much less Gothic. I think that this is the building that Dietrich Bohlen wanted Roberts Park to be. So Roberts Park is an Anglo-Methodist church. You can see that they are very similar. One is clad in limestone, one is made of brick. This is the German congregation. I think they had potentially a little bit more money, so they had the opportunity to add a tower, bell tower. I think this section right here in Roberts Park, the original plans show that there was supposed to be a very similar tower. It's not exactly the same, but I think that they're close enough where this is the building that he wanted Roberts Park to be.
I know a little bit about that. That is designed base for the tower for a steeple was to be higher than soldiers or as high. It was enormously high steeple, extraordinary, and it wasn't built.
It's not built. So Roberts Park, 1870, I believe, early 1870s, immediately post-war, and probably post-panic of 1872. Roberts Park, Lockerbie Central, around the same time.
That's just 10 years later.
Oh, early 1880s.
10 years ago.
Yeah.
1883, I think. So one thing that's interesting, I mentioned Emmaus, but I didn't include any pictures. They are one of the very few buildings in the city that still has a German inscription on the cornerstone. It says, to the glory of God, I believe, with a scripture verse. This one, if you look down here and read close enough in, it has the date, 1883, and then it's been chiseled away, the German inscription. I've not been able to find any sort of indication of what that said. It's probably a similar thing. Christ the chief cornerstone. I believe that it was chiseled off during World War I during the anti-German panic.
Or may have just said out.
Potentially. Yeah.
Cyrus is interested in having that re-chiseled in.
Really?
That's what he
It was
does.
exciting. So there were other German Methodist congregations in town. New Jersey Street. This one didn't really have too much going on. I don't know if the name like Byron Bastion sounds very German, but at some point there was a German Methodist contingent here downtown. East 10th Street, that building still stands. The congregation is still active. And you can still see here, this is very reminiscent of German architectural styles. Has very heavy massing. This kind of looks like the front of Emmanuel, United Church of Christ that we saw a little bit ago. And here is the third German Methodist church at Church and Morris Street, which I believe is right across the street from a former Episcopal church that is now an Eritrean Orthodox congregation, but they may have moved. So you can see this is much simpler, but it's still got the revival. It's got the gingerbread up there at the peak. It's got these pointed windows, and it's got the steeple.
And what was that church? That's my corner. I live just across the street from that. What was that called?
The Third German Methodist.
I'm sorry.
I think it would have been torn down before the merger. That area was devastated by the interstate coming through and sort of urban decline on the south side. Maybe. I think I went too far.
There was a German Methodist church in Terre Haute, and the cornerstone said G period M period E period. So I go, that sounds suspicious, and I figured it out. German Methodist Episcopal.
So that is the end of the slide portion of my presentation. The thing that I want to show you now is the map. So all of these congregations, I see that we're at almost 8:30, so I'll make this quick. The thing that is so interesting about all of this is what sort of trends can you take from all of this? So as we're looking downtown, the reds are Catholic churches. The purples are that sort of UCC predecessor congregations, and the yellows are Lutheran, and then these are destroyed. So regardless of denomination, if it is a circle, it's been destroyed. If it's a teardrop, it still exists. So I'm just going to zoom into the downtown area here for a second, and you can kind of see that this whole area that we're in had a bunch of congregations over time. Some of them have moved. Some of them have generally stayed in the same place. We can see that this is where St. Mary's started, and it moved up to here. So it's interesting to see these trends over time and sort of where were Germans living? Where were they meeting? You can do this with any ethnic group in a city. So if you go a little bit further south, can scroll south, and you can see that at a certain point, there was a shift to the suburbs that happened because these German neighborhoods were prime targets for interstate construction and for what we would term today sort of inner city movement by the Black community as happened. I don't like the term inner city, but here we are. So there was a lot of movement to suburban areas, and a lot of these congregations still exist in suburban areas. You can kind of see that there's a little cluster over here in Brookside, a little bit here out near Irvington, and then Hawville as well. Was relatively well populated with German folks, enough so that there were 2 Catholic churches in a very short distance of each other. So I appreciate all of you coming tonight. I do want to emphasize that we do have copies of the book. including some of these available for purchase. And my wonderful co-author, Katie, is here for at least a little while longer. So thank you all for this. It's been a pleasure. And are there any questions before? Yes.
I'm just curious. I'm a parishioner at Sacred Heart.
Okay.
And we're in the process of getting the church on the historic register. Do you have a sense of how many of these are on the historic register?
So,
And track.
kind of. So I have a spreadsheet of all the organs, but let me find. So here's a list of all of the congregations in Indianapolis in 1952 that still exist today in some form. I am also tracking a bunch of other things, including the National Register of Historic Places numbers. So of the 300 or so, there are 14 that are on the register.
Is St. John's, is St. Mary's?
So Holy Rosary, Bethel African Methodist Episcopal over on Vermont Street, Second Christian, All Saints Episcopal Cathedral, Christ Church, although some of these are not on the register themselves, they are as part of districts. There's also the the Danish Lutheran Church, that's part of the historic district. Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox is part of the district. Salem Lutheran up in New Augusta on the far northwest side is on it. Fletcher Place United Methodist, part of that district. Roberts Park. Sacred Heart is already on it, I believe. I am mistaken then, and we'll update as we speak. St. John the Evangelist is St. Mary's, I believe, is in the district. Holy Rosary is in the district, but it's not itself. And then St. Philip Neri is on it as well.
So St. Mary's is, St. John's is not.
St. John's is.
It is. Yeah. This is an incomplete list.
And then the Erste Deutsche Evangelische Kirche over here, a couple blocks over, that's part of the Lockery Square.
Yeah. So if you want to talk to somebody about getting a church or a building on the National Register, I think I know somebody sitting in the front row that might be able to assist.
Oh, not me.
But I do think that the contributions of the congregation and of the like the building itself to the history of the South Side, like it would not be the same area if not for Sacred Heart.
How did you ascertain what churches were here at 52 are still here? You just want to page turning on newspapers.
So I combined this list from a 1952 R.L. Polk's city directory, and then I went into Google Maps and looked at each of the individual places. And
you're a man after my own heart. I did that in Du Bois County.
Oh, awesome.
I wanted to see how many churches were in Du Bois County. It's amazing. But I would go every Saturday, the paper would publish where the church services were. I got back 60, 70 years.
Oh, wow. So by that, I was able to discern like what's a new building, what's an old building, what has been destroyed. And so that's where this list came from. And so from the 600 or so, there were about 300 that fit the criteria. I don't really like modernist architecture that much. So I skipped a lot of the newer construction after 1952 because, you know, I don't want to spend a Saturday driving around to 70 modernist churches. I'll let Katie do that for her next book. So there's some interesting ones, certainly, but there's a lot of bad ones that can fit in this room. And I'll leave it at that. Are there any other questions? Exactly. So the one that really sticks out as interesting does not mean good is St. Thomas Aquinas up at 40 something. Yes. Thomas Aquinas. And it's, you know, Evans Woolen had his time He had some good projects. He had some less than good projects. He was caught in the spirit of Vatican II. And that is what I will say about that.
Oh, it was actually on the cover of National Architectural Publication, Architectural Record.
Huh.
It's a real, that's a major achievement.
Yeah.
It's placed on that book from that magazine.
Did they put other bunkers on the cover? Did they put other bunkers on the cover?
In my opinion, the interior of that church is terrible.
It's very Protestant. It's like, yeah, it's like an auditorium, which is fine, but it's not my style. I much prefer like a Sacred Heart type of thing to the very industrial feel of the inside.
I just don't look at it that
Yeah.
same era. So.
Dr. James DeVita, at the request of the State Historic Preservation Office, wrote a paper about ethnic settlements. So you might want to have a look at that. That was the 80s.
Okay.
And then he tied it in with their architecture. So he says, of course, the church is the marker for ethnic settlements, which is absolutely true. So you might want to have a look at that.
I'll find it.
You know Dr. DeVita.
I sure do. I serve on the board of this august institution with them.
That's right.
Other questions?
You said that one church only had the cornerstones.
So Emmaus Lutheran
I
does.
think it says, Jesus Christus is der Eckstein.
Yes.
Now, was there any state high schools that had German spiritual people that?
I'm sure there are, but I am not aware of any off the top of my head.
Back home, St. John's had it.
Oh, yeah.
You skipped it for me.
So with that, I will concede the stage. Thank you all for coming. We do again have copies of the book. And I believe Katie has a square that you can swipe. There you go. Thank you, Cheryl.
It was, yeah.
Thank you much, everyone for coming. And obviously, we had this scheduled, and then there was something called COVID-19 interrupted, so we had to reschedule it. So we're planning on this one years ago.
Yeah.
So happy to have Lee's information and his enthusiasm for examining local architecture and finding its ethnic connections. That's a fun one.
It's a labor of love, more labor than love sometimes.
So in November on the 9th, where are we going to meet?
Carmel.
No.
Vonnegut Museum.
Vonnegut Museum and Library. Have a presentation by the founders of Whitehead. Because on the 11, Betty 2 is the 100th birthday of Bertrand.
And the armistice, right?
And the armistice and Martin's Tag at the beginning of Carnival season.
I was in St. Louis last summer.
Yes.
On this church. Is that